The new tractor died in the middle of the north field, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. Frank Whitfield sat behind the wheel, turning the key twice, 3 times, listening to nothing but a dashboard full of warning lights he didn't understand. The dealership was 60 miles away. No technician free for 6 days. 6 days? In the last week, anyone in Marsh County could still get seed in the ground and call it a normal season. He looked out across 200 acres of unplanted dirt. Then he looked toward the machine shed, where a rusted green tractor his father had left behind 3 years ago sat exactly where it always had. Except this time, it wasn't just sitting there. His son was already walking toward it with a set of keys in his hand. 3 months earlier, that tractor hadn't run at all. Frank had made sure everyone in the family knew it probably never would again. This is the kind of thing that happens on a farm when nobody's looking. A kid quietly working on something everyone else has already written off. Stay with it. This one earns the ending. Caleb Whitfield was 13 that winter, the second of 2 boys on a 400-acre row crop operation his family had worked for 3 generations. His grandfather, Walt, had died 2 years before. The old farmall he'd driven right up until his last season had sat parked in the back of the machine shed ever since, untouched, its engine seized from sitting so long without running. Frank had looked at it more than once and thought about hauling it off for scrap. He never quite got around to it, the way a man puts off dealing with anything that reminds him too much of his father. That January, with grain prices soft and the operating loan already stretched thin, Frank sat the family down at the kitchen table. The main tractor, an aging but functional machine that had carried the farm for over a decade, was starting to need repairs he couldn't keep affording piecemeal. He was going to the bank. He was buying new. Caleb didn't say much at the table. He waited until his father had gone out to the barn, then asked his mother, Sandra, if she thought Grandpa Walt's old tractor could ever run again. Sandra kept the farm's books. She knew exactly how much the new loan was going to cost every month for the next 7 years. She told him honestly that she didn't know, but that it couldn't hurt to look. If you've ever quietly worked on something nobody else believed in, you already know why Caleb didn't ask permission before he started. He just went out to the shed with a flashlight. Caleb's older brother Wade, 17 and mostly focused on finishing his last year of high school, thought the whole idea was pointless. "That tractor's older than Dad," he said. "Let it rust." Frank, when Caleb finally worked up the nerve to ask if he could try fixing it instead of the family taking on new debt, gave him a long look. "Fine. Mess with it if you want. Doesn't change what I'm doing about the real tractor." The loan went through in February. A brand new tractor, loaded with computerized systems Walt's old farmall never had, arrived on a flatbed the first week of March. Frank parked it in the yard like something he was still getting used to owning. Caleb kept working in the shed anyway. He found Ernie Hollenbeck through the church bulletin board, an 81-year-old retired mechanic who'd spent 30 years turning wrenches on exactly this kind of machine. Ernie came out on a Saturday, walked around the old farmall twice, and told Caleb the engine wasn't dead, just stubborn. Seized pistons. A fuel system that needed to be stripped down completely before anything would turn over again. It wasn't a weekend job. It was a winter's worth of weekends, and Ernie offered to show him how, if Caleb was willing to do the actual work himself. Caleb was willing. Every Saturday through March and into April, he drove 2 miles to Ernie's place for parts or drove Ernie out to the farm. Together they worked through the fuel lines, the carburetor, a starter motor that had to be special ordered from a salvage yard in Nebraska because nobody stocked parts for a machine that old anymore. Frank walked past the shed most evenings without stopping in. Wade thought it was a waste of a Saturday. Their neighbour, a farm equipment dealer named Kurt Redding, who'd sold Frank the new tractor, told Caleb once, not unkindly, that he was putting a lot of work into something that belonged in a museum, not a field. The starter motor arrived in early April, 3 weeks late. By the time it was installed and the fuel system was finally clean, planting season was less than 2 weeks away. The old farmhall still hadn't turned over. Then Ernie went into the hospital. Pneumonia, the 2nd week of April. 10 days, maybe longer. The doctors weren't sure yet. Caleb drove out to see him once, and Ernie, propped up in a hospital bed with an oxygen line under his nose, told him everything should be ready to fire now, that it was just a matter of getting the timing right. Caleb went home that night and tried it alone for the first time. It didn't go well. The engine caught, roared, backfired hard enough to send a jet of black smoke and a lick of flame out of the exhaust stack, and Caleb had a fire extinguisher off the shed wall and the flame out before it caught anything else. Hands shaking, ears ringing in the sudden quiet afterward. He sat down on the dirt floor of the shed for a long time that night. He didn't go back out to try again for 2 full days. Frank found him sitting there when he came looking for a socket wrench. He didn't ask what had happened. He just stood in the doorway a while, looking at the scorch mark on the shed wall, then looked at his son and told him quietly that Walt used to say the timing on these old engines would try to kill you before it would run right, and that this was normal, not a sign to quit. It was the most either of them had said about the project since October. Caleb went back out the next morning. He called Ernie's hospital room and had him walk through the timing sequence one more time, slower, step by step, and adjusted it exactly the way he was told, one small turn at a time, checking it against everything he'd already checked twice. The farmhall finally turned over clean on a Tuesday evening in the last week of April, settling into a rough idle that gradually smoothed out as Caleb held his breath and waited to see if it would hold. It held. He sat on the fender in the dark for a while after that, listening to an engine that had almost taken his eyebrows off 2 nights before, now running steady, like it always had. Planting started the 1st week of May. The new tractor handled the first 3 days without any trouble, and Frank seemed, for the first time since February, satisfied with the decision he'd made. Caleb parked the old farmhall back in the shed, its work apparently done. On the 4th day, the new tractor's hydraulic system failed in the middle of the north field. An electronic fault. The dashboard flagged it with a code Frank had to look up on his phone, standing in the dirt with 200 acres still unplanted. He called the dealership. 6 days out, same as before. He called Kurt Redding directly. Kurt was apologetic but honest. These systems weren't something a local shop could fix, not without dealer software, and a part that had to ship from the manufacturer. Frank stood in the field a long moment, looking at 200 acres of unplanted ground. Then he drove back to the yard, walked into the shed, and found Caleb already there, already reaching for the keys. Neither of them said much on the drive back out to the field. Caleb drove the old farm-awl. Frank followed in the truck. The farm-awl pulled the planter through the north field without a single hiccup that day, or the next, or the 4 days after that, while the new tractor sat parked in the yard waiting on a part that finally arrived one day after the Whitfields finished planting the last of their 400 acres, entirely on a machine Frank had once figured for scrap. Kurt Redding drove out that week, mostly to check on the new tractor's repair. He stood at the edge of the yard for a while, looking at the old farm-awl parked beside it, dust still on its tires. He didn't say much about museums this time. He asked Caleb eventually if Ernie Hollenbeck ever took on more work, because he had 2 older customers with equipment sitting idle who might want a second opinion before they scrapped anything. Frank never sold the new tractor. He never stopped paying on the loan either. That debt was real, and it stayed real for years after that spring. But he started keeping the old farm-awl running too, tuned and ready in the shed. Not a backup anymore, just a tractor that had already proven what it could do when everything else stopped working. He told Caleb once, without much ceremony, that his father would have liked knowing the old girl had one more season left in her. Caleb didn't say much back. He'd already known that for months, since the night he sat alone on the dirt floor of the shed and decided to go back out anyway. What's something you fixed instead of replaced when everyone told you it wasn't worth the trouble? Tell us in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching this from. And if this story was worth your time, go ahead and subscribe. We've got a new one like it every single week.